Hi, this is COMP1010 at the University of Manitoba. I'm Dr. Celine Latulip, and today I'm going to be talking to you about nested if statements and the if-else-if structure. Okay, so before we get started with nested ifs and the if-else-if structure, it's important to note a small programming detail that can really make you look like a newbie if you do it wrong. And that is when you're using a Boolean variable inside of an if statement. So if you're doing this, so say you have a Boolean variable called draw circles, and you want to test whether or not it's true, you just use that Boolean variable. Because the processing compiler will go and get the value in it, and it will either be true or false. So what you don't do is this, where you say, if Boolean variable equals true. You just don't need to do this. If Boolean variable is true, this will be true. If it's false, this will be false. You don't need to test against it, okay? So what you do is this. And if you want to only do something if the Boolean variable is false, you put the negation sign at the front of it. And that's how you use Boolean variables correctly. Never test against equality against true or false. Okay, so nested if statements. So we can actually do an if statement inside of the if block or the else block of an if statement. And this is called nesting. And so we want to do this when there's certain types of dependencies. So we make one decision, and then once that decision is made, then we have other decisions to make that were dependent on the first decision. So in this example, imagine that we're drawing circles if the mouse is pressed, and if the mouse isn't pressed, we're drawing rectangles. But once we've made the decision about which shape we're drawing, so if we're drawing circles, then we also have to look and see if we're drawing the circles in green or red. Okay, so let's have a look at what this code might look like. And I think I said it wrong. So we're drawing circles depending on the state of this Boolean variable, draw circles, which starts off as true, but could change here if somebody presses a key on the keyboard. So draw circles is either going to be true or false. If it's true, then we're going to use this ellipse command. And we're going to do this block, the if block. If draw circles is false, we'll do the else block, and we're going to draw a rectangle. But then once we've decided what shape we're drawing, we have then a secondary decision to make. So once we've decided we're drawing circles, then if the mouse is pressed, we want to fill the circles with green. But if the mouse isn't pressed, we want to fill the circles with red. So these colors are only for circles, red and green. If we've got draw circles to be false and we're drawing rectangles, then we have a different decision to make. And in this case, if the mouse is pressed, we're drawing blue rectangles, and if the mouse isn't pressed, we're drawing yellow rectangles. So we're not using yellow and blue if we're drawing circles, and we're not using red and green if we're drawing rectangles. So these if statements have to come inside of the bigger if statement where we make the decision about the shape. There's a dependency here. Okay, and so this is a good example of nested if statements. So we have this if statement is nested within and only executed if draw circles is true, and this if statement is nested in the else block and is only executed if draw circles is false. Okay. All right, so this is a good example of when you might use nested if statements where there's choices to be made and the order of the choices is important and there's a sort of a dependency. You can't choose the color until you know whether you're drawing circles or rectangles in this case. All right. You don't want to use nested if statements when you have multiple unrelated things to make choices about. So if the color is independent of the shape, then nesting the ifs is a bad idea. So if we're going to fill green when the mouse is pressed and fill red otherwise, regardless of what shape we're drawing, then this code where we have the nested if statements is really bad form. So look at this. Here we're again making our decision about whether we're drawing circles based on this Boolean, and then we have this nested if statement where we're checking whether the mouse is pressed, and we're setting it to green if it is and red otherwise. And then if draw circles is false, we have this else block, and here we have the exact same block of code where we're setting it to green if the mouse is pressed and red otherwise. these are identical. And it's always a bad idea when you've got identical blocks of code multiple places. So this decision about the color is completely independent of the decision about what we're drawing. And so it shouldn't be nested like this. This is, if we have to then suddenly change this, we've got to change it in two places. And so this if statement should be separated out and done just once. So the correct way to do this is to do this this way. So we have one if statement where we're figuring out the color, and then we have another if statement where we're figuring out what we're drawing and doing the actual drawing. And this is actually just much easier to look at and read because it's sequential, and the code is shorter too because we're not repeating this block of code. Okay. Sometimes we actually need what I would call multi-segment ifs, and this is when there's more than two choices to be made. So a really good example of this is to think about something like tax brackets, where we have progressive tax, where these numbers are completely made up, but imagine people who earn less than $15,000 a year pay no tax. If you earn between $15,000 and $30,000, you pay 10% tax. If you earn between $30,000 and $60,000, you pay 20%. And if you earn more than $60,000, you pay 30% in taxes. So it's not a choice between paying taxes or not. It's a choice between 4 different brackets, and that determines how much taxes you have to pay. So we could do this with nested if statements. And this is what the code over here looks like when we do that. And this works. So we've got some taxation rates here that are constants. We have a salary, which at this point is set at $45,000, and we have a float that we're calculating, which is how much taxes is paid. So the first thing we do is we test if the salary is less than $15,000, which is our lowest range. And in that case, we're going to say taxes equals the salary times no tax, which is 0.0. If we're not in that range, then we check the next range up, and the order here does matter. So now we check if salary is less than $30,000, then taxes equals salary times the low tax rate. And if that's not true, then we have another nested if statement where we check if the salary is less than $60,000, and in this case, we're multiplying by the mid-tax rate. And if that isn't true, then this last final sort of default else part will multiply the salary by the high tax rate. So this works, and you can see that when we run this with a salary of $45,000, the employees pays $9,000 deducted, and this is their take-home pay. So this is the mid-tax range, which is 20% of $45,000, and that makes sense. So this works, but it's kind of hard to read. All these nested if statements just get really hard to sort of keep track of. So a better way to do this is to do, not to do this else if nested if indentation, which is what we see here, because it's kind of ugly and there's a lot of indentation required and it's hard to read. This is all the different levels of nesting in that structure. We've got 4 levels of nested if statements. So a better structure is to do if else if, and that's what this looks like. So we test the first thing, and if that's not correct, then we do else if and do another test. And if that one doesn't work, then we do else if and then another test, and then we have a final else. And so you can see there's actually a lot less indenting here. So this is the same code, but with the else if structure. And so here we have else if, and we have the test, we have else if, we have the test, we have else. So the code is pretty much identical, except that we don't have more curly braces. We've got fewer of them because we're not actually nesting this whole thing inside of an else block. We're doing else if. And so here we have the exact same result. This doesn't change the result. It's just a better way of structuring the code. Okay. So this is more readable, and we require a lot less indentation, and you can sort of see that these tests sort of line up, so they're easier to find visually as you trace through the code. All right, so here's another example. If we wanted to use our pen drawing example, we wanted to use 4 different colors for the 4 different quarters of the canvas. So red in the top quarter, green in that second quarter down, but still in the top half, blue in that third quarter down, and purple in the bottom quarter then we can do it with this else if structure. And I've actually got this in our processing example right here. So here's our pen, and we've got this structure. So first we check if the mouse is less than height divided by 4. Then we check if that's not true, then we'll check if mouse is less than height divided by 2, which is the top half. And if that's not true, then we check if mouse is less than height times 3/4, so in that third quadrant. And if that's not true, then we must be in that bottom quadrant, and we set our stroke color to purple. So let's have a look at what this looks like. And here we're drawing, up here it's red, and then we get down here, it's green. We get down into the third quadrant and it's blue, and when we get down into the bottom quadrant, it's purple. And we can just see these changes happening as we draw. And we've got 4 different choices that are being made with this if-else structure. What's important to note with this is that the order matters. We have to check this top one first. If we made this be times 3/4 and we checked first if the mouse was anywhere above that 3/4 line that's close to the bottom, then this is going to be true a lot of the time, and we're going to, as soon as one of these is true and we execute the line in here, we skip everything else. So if this is true, we're going to skip over these other ones, and that would give us not what we want. In that case, we have red almost the whole time until we get down to purple at the bottom. And again, that's because mouse Y is less than this. Whenever we're up here, this is less than 3/4 of the height. And so we execute this line, set the color to red, and we skip everything else. So if we want to capture when mouse Y is less than 1/4, we've got to check that one first. So we have to do that first. And that should be what we want. Okay, so hopefully that gives you a good sense of how to do, when and how to do nested if statements, when it's appropriate, when there are dependencies on the choices, and also when you have choices that are not just between 2 things, an if-else doesn't work, and then you need the else-if type structures to check multiple different conditions. Thanks for watching.